um, in the, before the resurrection. So when you look at the symbolism in the Holy of Holies, you had other things. In the tomb, you had other things, right? So sometimes the symbolism varies based on those big analogies. Okay, um, so you also have what we call the niche or the niche, right? Which is that little curved part in the beginning. We don't, so don't take this as the prime example, because number one, we didn't build it from the ground up. Number two, it's not a permanent consecrated church, um, uh, which we'll get to later, right? So sometimes if you visit Egypt, and some of the ancient churches are like this, but also um, here, like you'll find some of the churches here that were built from the ground up has like if you go to again like Saint Nina Riverside, um, Saint Saint Mary, Saint George, a lot of these the older churches um, that were well established in America for like 40 years almost um, will have this part of these design characteristics. Okay, so the curved part reminds us of the bosom of God. Okay, so we even call it the bosom of the Father. Okay, to show us His love, right? Um, and so um, this part it should be. It's kind of a lot of steps. But it should be raised at least one step above the rest of the whole church. Okay, and sometimes as you when we have a chancel here, um, it should be raised above that too, because it's the holy of holies. Okay, this is the only place that symbolizes heaven, and everything else is more as a symbol of what we find in earth. So that's why it should be above. Okay, and we should also take off our shoes, right? Um, like with the story of Moses in the burning bush, where he said, "Take off your shoes, for the place that you're standing is holy ground." That's why we take off our shoes when we go into the altar. Right? It should be facing the east, like we explained last time. Um, it should be the most reverence. Okay, um, and it should be only the clergy that that go inside, and actually even the time we go in should be mainly for the service. Okay, um, I shouldn't have meetings in here and stuff. It's not appropriate. Okay, because it's consecrated for a specific purpose. Um, any questions on this? I think this one is straightforward. So the main thing that we find in the sanctuary is the what's the main thing you find in there? The altar, right? That's the main thing that care and the church reminds us of. Sorry, the altar reminds us of what? Location of the sacrifice, right? So what is the ultimate sacrifice? It's not a trick question. What is the perfect sacrifice? Or who offered the perfect sacrifice? The Lord Jesus Christ. Where? On the cross. So altar equals cross, right? Um, a lot of times it's made out of wood, right? It can also be made out of stone for the reason that we gave before, or marble, because it also the sanctuary also reminds us of the tomb. Remember when the disciples went in and they peeked in to see um, uh, where the body of the Lord was, and they didn't find it. Right. So this also should remind us of too. So um, the altar can be either made out of marble or a precious stone, or even precious metal like gold, which is very rare to find in our church. You might find it in other Orthodox churches. We're thinking maybe one day in our church to have three: one gold, one wood, one marble. It's just an idea, but because you know how Simon Peter said, um, "Let us make here three tabernacles: one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." Anyway, it's just ideas, um, but also to teach the fact that um, the altar can be made of different materials as long as the symbol as long as the material is symbolic of something that we learn according to the rite. Yes, please. Yeah, there's one church in Egypt. I forgot the name of the city. Um, they have seven altars, and instead of the church being this way, well, it's this way. It's super wide, and they have seven altars. Um, hmm? I don't think there's seven there. I'm not sure. Um, I could be wrong. There's seven churches in Old Cairo, seven ancient churches. Um, but I think Max is talking about um, St. Anthony Church, but I forgot the name of the city, has seven altars. Um, okay, altar means the place where the sacrifice is slain. That's what it means in Greek and also in Latin. Okay, in Coptic means, or the literal word is pima in Irsho Oshi. It's okay, we don't have to explain that, right? But in also another word in Greek is trapeza, and that's where you get the Arabic word tarabez. It just means table, okay? But we say this holy table, so it's not just any table, it's something consecrated for God, and it reminds us again of the Lord's table. So when you hear the word or the phrase the Lord's table in the New Testament, what does that mean? Hmm? Like when we say the Lord's Supper, right? Lord's table, Lord's Supper, communion, right? On Holy Thursday. Okay? Um, so what else? Um, the shape of the altar is supposed to be cubic, like not elongated, not rectangular, whereas you find that in other churches with other rites. Um, and it's not supposed to be circular, but it's supposed to be a cube, because it reminds us that the direction to God, from the way to God from any direction is the same. It also reminds us of the altar um, that is found in the book of Revelation, or even the city itself is described as cubic. Okay? Um, Oftentimes, uh, it it is not solid because inside the altar is usually placed the relics of the saints, or used to be. The relics of the saints were under the altar, and then what also put the relics inside the altar, but nowadays we like to put them outside for the people to take the blessing of. Okay, but initially it was inside or under the altar, so that's why the altars are carved out. And nowadays we also put the holy vessels inside as well. Okay, um, I don't think we need any other explanation there. So yeah, see, like in the picture, you have the altar in the middle. Usually there's nothing else there except the items relating to the altar. Um, and then on the very eastern wall, you have the niche or the icon of the bosom of the Father, where everyone is directing, even the priest praying, is directing our sacrifices and prayers towards the Lord Himself. Okay. So what else do you find in the sanctuary? You find the altar board. If the altar is not consecrated, consecrating means like permanent. So Sayyidina will come and anoint, or actually, it's a very lengthy prayer for the altar itself to make it holy with the holy oil, right? Because this is not our permanent location, we haven't done that with this church of this altar. So we get a piece of wood that the bishop consecrated with the holy oil, and we place that on the table, and it becomes the holy altar. Make sense? Yes. Um, so there's a lot. So basically, the board, there's plenty of pieces of wood in Egypt, right? But it doesn't become a holy board until the bishop prays on it. And usually the bishop, like when we had it prayed on here, I brought it to Abdelsayed and he's like, "What church is this for? What are you going to use it for?" He didn't say how many do you have, but basically he wants to make sure that each holy board is accounted for, so no one can take an extra and go liturgy permission. Okay, so it's a big deal. Yes. So right now we consecrate the wood, but ideally, if this is going to be our permanent home for the church, and that's going to be our permanent altar, then we bring the bishops and they do a very extensive prayer um, during the Sunday liturgy, and they bring. Um, back in the day, actually, we would wait for the Pope to come, and with tons of bishops, and then they would, because it's a big deal, and then they anoint with the holy maroon oil um, after like many prayers, and sometimes it goes all night. So there's a consecration of an altar. There's a consecration of the whole church. That's an even bigger deal, where they start from the afternoon before and they go all night with the consecration prayers, and they finish with the liturgy in the morning. It's really tiring from what I've heard. I've never attended, but that's like the one of the lengthiest prayers that we have in our church. So you can consecrate the church, you can consecrate just the altar, or you could consecrate the altar board, and then all of the things that we'll see in the majority of the items that we find in the altar should be consecrated by the bishop with the holy oil. Question. Um, for the holy board and like the Sharia, and they just maroon on their thumb and they just do small crosses. For the altar, a lot, and they start rubbing the holy oil all into the. Usually they do it for the marble top. I don't know what they do for the wood. I've never seen that. Okay, so this is what the holy board looks like. Usually it has a cross or crosses. They have alpha omega because God is the beginning and the end. And sometimes they put some that relate to the altar um, that you find in the Psalms. Okay, I think that's it for this. The next items that we find um, are what we call the canopy or the ciborium. Okay, um, ciborium, that's taken from the Greek word kiborion, which just means the. Have you ever seen the Egyptian water lily? Like, so anyway, um, the bottom of it is like it's like a shape of an arc, right, or a semicircle. Okay, and you flip it over, it's just a dome. Okay, so that dome should be found around the church because it reminds us of heaven. Okay, the dome is symbolic of heaven. Okay, so we'll find this canopy or ciborium sometimes in some churches. Yeah, took some pictures. Sometimes you'll find it above the bishop's chair. Sometimes you'll find it above the altar or as part of the altar. And sometimes you'll just find it in the church, like either one big one or sometimes five. We'll get to the domes more, but ciborium is more specific. It has to do with the dome-shaped covering above something else. Okay. The third place is what we use for when we give communion to the sick. When tell the deacon, get the ciborium. Actually, he's not supposed to touch it, but this is the container that we put the holy body and the blood in, and we call that ciborium too, because it contains the holy of holies, the communion. And a lot of times, like the ones we have, they're not flat on the top; they're dome shaped. Okay. Any questions on the ciborium and the canopy? Okay. So some people say the altar is supposed to be simple in its design. They say there shouldn't be any engravings because that was the prescription in the Old Testament of a lot of the things that were found in the Holy of Holies, because God didn't want them to make a rukat when they're doing construction. Um, and so some people say that's what we do for the altar now, but 99% of the altars that we have now have engravings and carvings and crosses and things on it. But in some of the earlier churches, they decided to decorate the ciborium more, you know, with icons and frescoes and things like that. So when you go to ancient churches, you'll see that all over the church. And if there's a ciborium, which there's not many left nowadays, but you'll also find that. See how like there's, I don't even know what this church is, but you'll find icons and frescoes all over the altar, especially right above the altar. Okay, and usually it's the angels and the cherubim and uh, probably Christ um, in the dome. So then we have the tribune, which is the eastern wall of the sanctuary, like what I was saying, the niche. Um, it's supposed to have 7 steps, like we say. And it reminds us of the 7 orders of the priesthood. And in the very east, there used to be, we don't have it anymore. Oh, that was the question. Remember I gave you homework last time? I said, what item, if you read, anyone read the notes? Okay. No? Okay, you guys need to read. I'm only asking you to do like 10 pages before each meeting or after. So we're doing 10 pages, like, not a 20 pages a week. It's not that much, right? Okay. And they're even pre-highlighted for you most of the pages. So it should be really easy. But I was asking the question, what in the material here do we find that used to be in the church, and we don't really have it anymore in 99.9 of the churches, that Coptic churches that you find around the world? It's not in existence. Right? You find the 7 steps. You find the bishop's throne, but when the bishop's throne is outside of the church here, altar, you'll find it here on the north side of the of the church. That's called I forgot the name. Anyway, it has a term. Sorry, I'm losing my mind. um, it's called the cathedra. Yes, like for cathedra. So usually it's supposed to be only the church that the bishop resides in, which is called the cathedral, right? They should have one cathedra, which is the throne of the bishop. Like, so technically in our diocese, we're only supposed to have one cathedra in, like, if you consider like St. Maurice, the residence of the Metropolitan, that should be the only place where you have the cathedra. Right? But now the churches have it, which is fine. But that was not the original location of the throne of the bishop. Where do you think it was? It used to be in back of the altar on the last step, facing the people. When he gives the blessing or when he gives the sermon, it should come to the people from the altar. Kind of cool, right? But I guess because it was a little bit awkward of the people facing the bishop when they're praying, similar like what we were talking about with other churches nowadays, the church moved it to be here. And so, like when you see the nativity or the resurrection liturgies in Egypt with the Pope, where is the Pope seated? Here. And Abdelsayed does the same thing at St. Maurice, right, on Easter. He'll sit here for the first part of the liturgy, and he'll give the sermon from here, and he'll read the gospel from here. That's That's the proper thing to do. Okay, so we do those things on the feasts. Okay, so when it's in the tribune, when the chair is in the tribune, it's called the synthronos. Okay, the throne, like reminding us of the throne of God. When it's here, it's the cathedra, reminding us of the cathedral. Okay, any questions? That's just the information about the throne. There's many um, stories of the humble bishops in the early church who refused to sit on the chair. I'm thinking maybe that's why they kind of took it away from there. And the other bishops and priests used to sit next to him on those 7 steps. So again, that's why we say those steps remind us of the 7 orders of the Church of God, like we say in the liturgy. Okay, um, moving on. No questions? So the niche, I already spoke about it. This is also called the apse, or the curved part in the very east of the altar or sanctuary, and it surrounds the throne of the bishop, right? Reminding us of the angelic hosts who are surrounding the throne of God. Okay, um, and usually the icon that is in the very far east is something that relates to the glory of God. Usually it's the second coming. Sometimes it's Christ on the throne, or we call the Pantocrator, the Almighty, similar to this. Um, and usually, or in the early days, um, there should be a light or a lamp that is not extinguished. So reminding us that God is ever present. Okay? Um, I don't know, maybe because of fires or something, they don't do it anymore. But some churches put like even an electrical lamp there that's continually on. Um, Not in our church, but other churches where sometimes they keep a piece of the Holy Communion um, throughout the week uh, to give if someone's sick or something, they'll also put it in that area. Okay, but we don't do that. Okay, um, any questions? Okay, is this boring? Interesting. It's new stuff. Like I think once you start learning about all the details, like you see how rich our church is. Okay, so some other items. I'm not going to go into the extreme detail, but just terminology, right? So what is the pattern? One of those things on the picture here is the pattern. Yes. Huh? Chalice? Oh, you mean the star? I don't know why. I think it's a reflection. It's only 4. Sorry, it's an optical illusion. Okay. Okay. The pattern is the plate. Okay. The chalice is the cup. Right. The mystere. Anyone know? No. There's a couple of parts in the liturgy where it can be used for the incense, but the mystery is the spoon that we use to give communion. Okay. Um, early chalices actually were commonly made out of wood, glass, or pottery, um, but by the later century, they used precious metals like gold and silver, because sometimes the glass would break, and that would be a big problem if it broke during the liturgy. There even I just learned about this um, maybe a couple of years ago. There's actually a special prayer that you do if the glass breaks and there's no wine during liturgy. What do you do for communion? So there's like a special emergency prayer you do with the new wine. But we've never, thank God, we've never had to use that because, um, and so even though like we still use gold and precious metal, there were some early church fathers that were against this because it was like, why don't you use the money for the poor, but of course this is for the glory of God, and then also would cause distractions because barbarians or raiders would come in and try to steal. They don't care about anything else in the church. They just want gold and the precious metal. But our problem is we can't just give it like they're holy. They're sanctified. Yes, break for this is for the blood for but still, I mean, this is just metals, and it's probably the most practical to use nowadays. Which one? If you the pottery, yes, it's not as long lasting. So the whole idea is we want something long lasting that doesn't rust. That's why we use gold. So when you see gold in the church, it reminds us of heaven because it shouldn't rust, it shouldn't decay, it should last forever. It's an expensive metal. So when you see gold in the icons, when you see gold in the Sharia, when you see gold uh, like decoration all over, it reminds us of heaven. Okay? Okay, I won't go into the other details. There's too many here. Um, I missed notes, but yes, Isaiah. Why an ostrich egg? Anyone know? I'm sure we. Yes, so ostrich is very protective of children, just like God is protective of us. But also, the ostrich is known to stare intensely at the egg until the baby is hatched, right? Just like we are supposed to stare intently at the altar until Christ comes in us, right? So, um, do you need another one? Anyone? So, um, yes. It would be super heavy to carry a precious stone. Uh, like I barely could carry the metal one, the one in it. Like, but I mean, I'm sure it's been done before. I wouldn't do it. Okay. Um, so what is the star? It's the little cross-shaped thing that we put on top of the paten to remind us, one practically, so that you can cover it without the without the fabric touching the body, but also um, the 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 cross on top reminds us of what we call it, the what, the asterisk or the star, because the star hovered over where the body of the Lord, the baby Jesus, was in the manger. That's what star. Get it? So there's like biblical references and theologic reasoning for why we call all these things, all these things. Okay. Okay. Um, yes, both of them. Okay. So what else? The cruets. Those are the containers for the water and the wine. Okay. The ark or the throne is not the throne of the bishop. It reminds us of the Ark of the Covenant. Well, the Ark of the Covenant carried what in the Old Testament? Anyone know? Yes, it carried the Ten Commandments, which reminds us of what the rod of Aaron, which reminds us of the thing. the pot of manna, which reminds us of the body of Christ, right? So um, the ark is seen in this picture. When we open, oh, let me show you. So when we open up the curtain of the altar, that wooden box above the altar, that's called the throne or the ark. Why? Because um, it contains the chalice, which is the blood of Christ. Okay, and it's also where Christ is seated, the throne of God. So, and some deacons or some churches prefer to put, like I said, the Ten Commandments remind, right? And the rod of Aaron reminds us of the cross. So after liturgy, they would put the Bible and the cross inside the throne during, like, before the liturgy starts. So deacons, if you're like attending another church and Abuna is starting to prepare the altar and you can't find the cross or the gospel, it's probably inside the ark of the throne. Okay. Uh, um, the gospel should be on on the altar where we receive the word of God. This is from heaven, but also practically during the service there should be, so we have a metal container, we call it the evangelium or the gospel. Do I have to bring it out, or you guys know what I'm talking about? You know what I'm talking about? When the deacon brings it out and says, pray for the Lord. Right. Do you know what's inside of it? The gospel. Okay. And in the early days, it used to be bigger, and they would actually read from that book when it comes time to read the gospel. Okay. I think that's enough for now. It's kind of too much detail. But the censer? Can we bring one out? Okay. This is not the most obvious. It's missing a couple things. But can someone tell me the symbolism of the Sharia? Yes, Mina. I can't hear you. Cross. Yeah, there's a cross right here. Thank you. Anything else? But you're right. The cross here is sometimes in the Eastern Orthodox churches, they don't put a cross here. They put like two eagle heads, which has nothing to do with us. It's more of like a Byzantine, I don't know, cultural thing. But for us, the cross is above this dome, right? And this reminds us of the tribune, right? So we said the tribune sorry, not the tribune. The ciborium reminds us of what? Guys, for that. Huh? Heaven, right? So if this is heaven, then what is this? People say that the earth, and you can actually, that's a better definition, because if heaven is here and earth is here, it's connected by how many chains? It's actually four, but the three outside of the Holy Trinity, and this is kind of like the ladder of Jacob that connects heaven and earth. Okay. The hook is supposed to remind us of the priesthood. And then this is probably the most important part of symbolically. Yes. Yes, so in the liturgy, or the hymn Tishrei, we say the golden censer is the Virgin. Okay, so the holy censer reminds us completely, like as a whole, of Saint Mary. And then if this is Saint Mary, is her womb, and inside is the holy coal, the fiery coal. Fiery coal is both, it's the unity of fire and coal, or his humanity and his. Once you light the coal, you can't separate the fire from the coal, right? So once Christ took flesh, you can't separate his humanity from his divinity, right? And then it gives us a sweet smell of his aroma. Um, so, like in the hymn, we say, the aroma is our Savior. Okay? And St. Paul says, we are the aroma of Christ. So, the thing is supposed to smell good, not bad, right? And the incense or the smoke that comes up reminds us of the prayers that ascend to heaven, as mentioned in the book of Revelation. Okay, I think that was it. And something that this is supposed to have, what is this missing? It's supposed to have bells on the outside to remind us of the service. Yes, it should be made out of gold. Like we say, the golden censer, not the silver censer. Okay, yes. Well, the noise is supposed to be for a purpose. So the church uses all the senses. It uses the noise, the 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 sight, the sound, the smell. You find all of that in the liturgy, especially when the Shoria comes around. Okay. Um, all right. Moving on. Can you look at the questions? I can answer them all at home. Okay. Um, the candles and the lights. Okay. The use of lights in the church goes back to the days of Moses, when God commanded him to put lamps in the tabernacle and to light them or to fill them with oil every night and every day, so that there was continually light in the temple. Okay. Um, and the church should always be lit, but especially during the service, and especially during the gospel, and even more especially during communion. Okay, so when the deacon lights candles, it's to direct the people's attention that this is a very important time, and Abuna is doing something important, or we're reading something important. So what's the only reading where we light the candles for? The gospel, not for the other readings. Um, okay. Um, there's so many verses and references for this, so maybe I just ask you to look at them at home, because we can go on and on and on, but they're important, and I'm sure they're going to ask you some questions on the exam about the, the use of lights and lamps in the church. Okay, um, but for our purposes, what is the symbolism, right? God is light, just like transfiguration. So our church should be the most bright out of all the other churches. Um, we'll have to figure out a way to do that. We're going to have a lot of, like windows in the church, but the whole idea of um, God is light, and in him there is no darkness. So light is a symbol of glory. It is a symbol of holiness. It is a symbol of purity. It is a symbol of wisdom. And so that's why the church um, uh, wants to emphasize the importance of lights and candles. Okay, um, in the book of Revelation, you see the lampstand with the seven candles, right, surrounding the Lord, right, um, and even so. That's another reason why we have lights. Christ said, I am the light of the world, but he also said, you are the light of the world because you reflect Christ's light. Okay, just like the moon reflects the light of the sun. Okay, um, where do we find the big candles most of the time? We always have two big candles lit from the beginning of the service to the end. Yes. on both sides of the altar. Okay, we have, right? Um, Also in the gospel, you should have, right? In the sacraments, you should have. So, like, remember on Tuesday when we did the the La'an blessing of the water, we had candles there. Typically, in the marriage ceremony, you should have two candles on each side. It's a reminder of the presence of the angels and that this is a holy uh, event that we're participating in. Question? Yeah, it could be done in engagements too. Um, in funerals, also, you notice we put them both sides of the casket. Um, and not in this church yet, but maybe the next one, we can't put them in front of every icon because they are reflecting the light of the Lord. Okay? Um, Next. So now we're moving out of the altar or the sanctuary into the nave of the church. But before we get that, we have a dividing wall between the sanctuary and the nave, right? What do we call it? The iconstasis, because it's the place where the icons stand. Okay, if you want to remember it that way. Okay, um, and it's one of the most important architectural features of the Orthodox Church. Okay, um, it can be made of wood or marble. It should carry the icons of the Lord and His angels and the saints, and it should be in between the, like I said, the sanctuary and the nave. Um, there's variation on which icons and what the height should be, but in our Coptic tradition, there's a lot more similarities of what is present there. Um, Let me see. Sometimes you'll find doors in front of them, um, and even let's see, they put like icons in front of those doors, um, but nowadays, I don't know. In our churches, you find more curtains um, rather than doors. Um, Actually, in the rite of the consecration of the patriarch, they give him the keys to the doors of the church, but also um, there, there used to be, like, if you go into some of the ancient monasteries in Egypt, there will be wooden doors all the way across with crosses and symbols even in the the doors of the altar themselves. Um, and sometimes within the door, you would find windows, and that would be for two purposes. Anyone know? One, to give communion to people. So sometimes they would give communion to the people from those doors, from those windows in the doors. And the other one was uh, during the time of persecution, when they would watch to see for that, because the barbarians would attack during the service, and so they would peek to see if they're gone yet or if they're coming, and they would even have, like, we went to Egypt and Mahdi, and I don't know if you guys went. They have like an escape room where where you go from the altar, and they would lock the altar with those doors, and then they would escape underground outside of the church to a remote area where they could finish the liturgy and take communion, so that the barbarians don't um, disrespect the holy gifts. They didn't care about martyrdom; like, they wanted to be martyred, but they cared about preserving the holy body and the precious blood. Okay. Um, Anyways, um, that's the iconostasis. Um, do you guys know the order of what it should be? Like, do you want me to go into that? Too much detail? Okay, what's usually on the top? Huh? Above them? The cross, right? Um, Cross is usually on the top, right? And just below the cross should be? the Last Supper because that's what we're here for, right? And then around the um, or to the right and the left of the Last Supper should be the 12, right? And under them, it should be Christ and the Holy Virgin, and then the baptism and the Annunciation. The rest is kind of up for discussion, but generally speaking, the patron saint should be on just to the right of the Epiphany, and then um, we go around the church. The icons were basically now we put them based on the readings that we read on Palm Sunday and the Feast of the Cross. But back in the day, it was the opposite. The the readings reflect the icons that are present and not vice versa. If that makes sense. Okay, well, let's not go into that detail. Because it was the last meal that the Lord had. So for us in the Orthodox, we say there was a Last Supper, which was the meal, but then the First Communion. So maybe the icon of the First Communion is more appropriate. Um, but nevertheless, both occurred on that night. Okay. Um, okay, so just outside the iconstasis, we don't really have it in this church, but there should be a raised platform area um, for um, for the lectern for the readings, and there should be lecterns on both sides, one facing the people on this side and one facing the altar on this side, um, and it could either be one or two, or I don't know if it should be three. This says 3 steps higher than the rest of the nave. Okay, and this is where the readers could actually sit because they're going to go up to read, right? Um, and this is where, like we said, the bishop's throne is. And in a lot of other churches, there's a candle stand, which we don't see that much anymore in the Coptic churches. Okay. Any questions about the chancel? Okay. So actually, this is a picture of Holy Annunciation Church in Inglewood. They did a good job of separating the chancel from the rest of the church. I think you also find it in St. George and Archangel Michael too, but um, oftentimes they don't put a dividing wall in between. But I like this because it clearly separates those two areas. In the early churches or the ancient churches you find in Egypt, you'll find this a lot. Um, okay, question. So there's some direction that the church gives, but there's actually a lot of more flexibility. Nowadays, some people teach it has to be this icon, it has to be that icon, but there was more room for flexibility in the early church. So, um, like I said, on top should be the apostles or the disciples, and the Last Supper should be in the middle, the cross should be on the top, and then what we have here is like more of the most common order. Usually, when you get to this left side, there's more room for argument. So some people say put Saint Mark there because he's the beginning of the church, head of the church, or the founder. Some people say put Archangel Michael because of the readings. Some people say no, put the patron saint, but usually the patron saint goes over there. And in some churches, if they have more than one patron saint, they'll put one here and they'll put one there. So there's room for flexibility. Okay. um, yes. No, it depends on the the architecture of the church. Sometimes the altar is huge and they put 20 icons there. Sometimes it's narrow and they only put 4. Like I've been in a chapel for His Holiness, where they didn't. they just started with the Epiphany, and on this side they started with the Annunciation, and technically that's appropriate too, because like you have the icon of the Pantocrator already inside. Um, the one on this side is kind of unique because there's two special readings for Palm Sunday, one for Saint Mary, one for the Annunciation. Anyways, um, any questions on the chancel? And one other thing in the chancel, there should be an elevated platform for the bishop um, to read and preach from. You'll find this a lot in the ancient churches, like the Hinging Church, and this is what I was talking about. If you remember last time, where we were talking about First Kings and Nehemiah, First Kings chapter 8, Nehemiah chapter 8. Those two chapters talk about its elevated platform for reading. Okay, and it should be elevated. Why? Because we're receiving the word from heaven, from God. Okay, and Moses went up the mountain to receive the Ten Commandments. The disciples went up the mountain to see the transfigured Lord, right? So that's why it should be a higher place than the nave. Okay, so like this whole place should be elevated 1, 2, or 3 steps. Okay, but the ambo could even be like the Western churches. If you go to Europe, anyone been to European churches, like the old ones? You'll find like a staircase on the side, and that's where they used to preach from. But it's the same symbolism. Okay, since you're getting tired, we'll just do the nave and we'll save the rest for later. The nave is simple. The word means ship, right? It's the body of the church, the chorus of believers. It's the place where God comes to meet with the people, right? And it's like, you know how we're made of body and soul, right? So the nave is like the body, and the sanctuary is the soul or the spirit. Okay? You can't have one with the other. The two work in conjunction, but they're both important for the growth and the health of the body. Okay. One thing about the separation or the way that seats should be organized, back in the day, each group of servants would sit together. The ones who either lived together or served together, they would sit in this place together. There was a place dedicated for them. So that's why, for example, the deacons, they all congregate together and they sit in one area. The nuns, they had a place where they would sit together and pray together in the church, right? Same thing for the widows, same thing for the women and the children. And so that's why when we say greet one another with a holy kiss, that's the group that they would greet. And so nowadays, the church kind of put just all the men on one side and all the women on another. But the Metropolitan said, well, what about the family? Would that be considered a unit that prays together and serves together? So let's have the families sit together as a unit. It's okay, right? But let's say you're coming to church without your family. The men, okay, so just sit on the men's side if you're male, and then vice versa. Okay, any questions? Okay. Sometimes there's pillars or columns in between the church, and a lot of times it's 12. Sometimes there's 4 big ones for the dome, and that reminds us of the 4 what? 4 incorporeal creatures, yes, but the 4 incorporeal creatures remind us of 4 other things. Huh? Yes, the four evangelists or the four gospels. So if you go to like maybe St. Mary Church or St. John Church, you'll find at the top of the columns four icons of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Right? That's intentional. It was not an accident. Okay. Um, okay. I think that's enough for now. Any questions? One of you, or are you good? Okay. Let me just make a note that we stopped at the name at the. Oh, sorry. One more thing before we get to the. So we finished the nave. We just had the la'an. We had the holy water. Remember on Tuesday, blessed over here, right? So in the early church, that thing used to be the bowl that we prayed on for the holy water. That used to be already immersed in the ground. Okay, and so on Palm Sunday when we pray for the baptism, or we read the gospel of the baptism back there. Actually, one of the priests was asking this yesterday. Why do we read this? So the Metropolitan was like, well, because that's where the end was, and that's where the bowl was. So when we go around the church, we're reminding us of not of the baptism per se, because we read of the baptism over here at the end of the service. But anyway, that tank or the laver it was called, it used to be smack dab in the middle, in the last third of the church. Because some people are asking me, why are we going all the way in the back of the church? Because that's what we should be praying. The book as we go to pray. So even though it's not in the ground, we should be praying over there. Okay, that's it. That's it for the nave. Okay, so question: where do I find the bishop's? Here. Where did it used to be? Very good. How many steps were 7? How many steps to the altar? It's a question. Okay, how many steps to the chancel? 1, 2, or 3. The book says 1 or 3, right? And how many to the altar from the chancel? It should be 1, at least 1. What do you find in the sanctuary? The number 1 thing? The altar. Very good. What is the reason why we have lamps and candles in the church? They remind us of the angels. Very good. I didn't even say that. Very good. What else? Yes. For the Bible, because thy word is a lamp unto my feet. What else? Not either. Transfiguration. You have to get that one. The glory of God, and to remind us of heaven in general. Okay. I think that's good for today. Next time we'll continue the last third of the church. What is that called? So the 3 main divisions of the church are the sanctuary, the nave, and the narthex. Okay, so remember that. That's important. Okay, glory be to God for okay. And the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Finally, Lord, make us worthy to pray thankfully. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. In Christ Jesus our Lord, thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Go in peace and peaceful youth. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Oh yes. Sorry, can we not the baptism tomorrow? And they're going to do. They set up already for their little reception. So please